15, 1 through 15. Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom of the feast to release the prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do it for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the King of Jews?" asked Pilate. Knowing it was out of envy, the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one who you call the King of Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, and he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified.
So, of course, we're in the season of Lent, and our sermon series has been 24 hours. Basically, the last 24 hours or so before, Jesus died. And it's really been interesting because as a pastor, well, we know the story, right? We know all about it. But to actually read through it again, to actually digest what was going on, it kind of hits you again. It really does. And I think that's one of the things I want to encourage you to do this Lent season, to read through the stories again yourself. Don't just hear what certain selections I picked out. Read it for yourself as well, because it does make a difference. Now, as I was reading this and reading the other gospel accounts, something kind of struck me that's relative to now. Hand washing. Hand washing is a big deal right now, isn't it? Washing your hands. I mean, they're talking about, make sure you wash your hands. Do you know that the average time people wash their hands is 6 seconds? Do you know that? How gross is that? I mean, let's be honest. And some of you may be thinking, "Oh, wow, that's way longer than what I do." But that's not the point. I'm not going to be pointing fingers here. But the point is that, especially now, we've been really encouraged to wash our hands, which we should be anyways, because, teachers have to deal with that with the little kids. Wash your hands. You go to the bathroom, you wash your hands. And we've been encouraged to do it even more. Wash the palms of your hands and the back of your hands and in between your fingers and underneath your fingernails. And of course they say make sure that you dry your hands really well, because germs don't stick to dry hands as well as they do to wet, which makes sense, right? And so there's a big, intense drive for us to wash our hands and keep our hands clean, because part of it is taking responsibility for your germs. That's what you're doing. You're acknowledging that, yes, I have germs, and I'm going to take care of them. Well, what's interesting is, in this account from Mark, it doesn't really talk about it. But there's another story of hand washing that happens in this same period, the same time. Actually comes from Matthew 27, verse 24. So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." You see, Pilate wasn't taking responsibility. He was shirking his responsibilities. He, was wussing out. he was being wishy-washy, ironically enough, washing his hands, about the decision that was before him. He didn't want to take responsibility. He was avoiding any decision that could potentially come back on him. He didn't want to be the one to make the choice. Now, if you didn't know, Marcus Pontius Pilate was, of course, a real guy. He was an interesting historical figure. He was a Roman prefect or governor for Judea for about 10 years, from AD 26 to 36. And this was during the time Tiberius was emperor. And considering who he was and what he did, something else that stood out. Pilate is actually mentioned in two of the most famous Christian creeds, the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. He's mentioned by name. Now, of course, he was certainly no angel. In fact, one of the ancient philosophers, Phileo, described Pilate as inflexible, merciless, and obstinate. Not a very nice person. Now, in Roman-occupied Palestine, Pilate, well, he didn't really get along with the religious figures in that area, because he didn't really like them. Because, well, first of all, their religion fought against him, and two, that was not his religion. So he had disagreements with them all the time. And it didn't help that when he came into the area, he plastered effigies and pictures and everything of the emperor all over the place. The coins were minted with the emperor's face, and there were all sorts of little pagan symbols all over the place. In fact, he actually put busts and pictures of the emperor in the Jewish temple. So, I mean, there was a reason they didn't like him either, besides the fact that he was conquering them. So there was a lot of headbutting between these groups of people. Interestingly enough, a little side note, Pilate was actually brought before the emperor years later for cruelty and oppression, namely for executing men without due cause. Interesting, isn't it? So the Jewish religious leaders were wanting to try Jesus for blasphemy, right? Saying that he claimed to be the Messiah, which he was, and he did claim that. But remember, Pilate could care less about the religion. So they did not come to Pilate and say he was being blasphemous. They never said that. What they said was, he's trying to commit treason against Rome. Now that's going to perk up his ears. He's going to pay attention to that. Because, again, he could care less about religious matters, really. It was probably more of an annoyance to him more than anything else. But when they brought Jesus before him and they said, he claims to be king of the Jews, they're telling Pilate he's part of a group that wants to overthrow Rome. He claims to have greater authority than you. That's going to catch Pilate's ear. That's going to make him pay attention. Now, if you didn't know, one of the reasons Pilate was actually in that area, or it suggested that he was in that area, is he had screwed up before. He had gotten in trouble for not doing something that the emperor had told him to do, or not quelling some other little fires and uprisings. So he was on the short time. He didn't want to get in trouble again, because you get in trouble and you take off the emperor on the wrong day, you're dead. So he was making sure that this did not happen. He could not allow it to happen. Now the religious leaders, of course, they had a whole other agenda. They wanted Jesus dead. That was their whole purpose. So they were playing the political game themselves. So they wanted him dead. And of course, we know from last week that only Rome had the right or the authority to put somebody to death. So, Pilate has Jesus before him, and he asks the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now really, Jesus doesn't really commit one way or the other, does he? He really just says, well, it's whatever you say. So it's not really saying yes, it's not really saying no, it's just kind of that middle ground, which of course Jesus was known for his interesting wordplay that can kind of throw people off. So Pilate was not thrilled with his answer, because you have to understand, for him to say yes to Pilate, he was not answering the question that Pilate was really asking. Pilate was really asking, are you trying to usurp my power? Are you trying to take over this province from me? Is your kingdom of the world? Because that's really what Pilate was asking. And of course, Jesus was not doing that. He was not a revolutionary in the sense that Pilate thought. He was not trying to take over the world like Pilate thought. His kingdom was not of the earth. And so he had to really get Pilate to understand what he was truly saying, but I think he was probably aware that Pilate was going to listen no matter what he really said. So he didn't really commit to an answer. And then Pilate comes back, well, aren't you going to answer? You're hearing all these accusations against you. Aren't you going to answer? Nothing. Which, again, I'm sure really did not make Pilate happy. Because he wanted an answer. He was, I don't know, maybe he was having a bad day and he just didn't really like his Jewish religious leaders anyways. He was just in a bad mood. I don't know. He wanted an answer. And he needed one. And I love that they use, in my translation and yours both, it says, Pilate marveled at Jesus' silence. And if you actually look at some of the language in the Bible, they use the word marvel also when it talks about people marveling at Jesus' miracles. And it's interesting that they use the same word in these separate incidents, which for us, why are you marveled by that? Miracles, okay, that makes sense. Miracles are pretty marvelous. But just being quiet, why is that such a marvel? But it is. Because, you see, in a situation like this, most men, women, whoever, who would be before Pilate would be begging, pleading for their lives, pleading for a lesser sentence, pleading for mercy. Jesus just stood there, silent. It was this dignified silence. I can just see him. All of these religious leaders, I mean, you can almost, I'm a very visual person, so I can almost see the steam coming out of their ears. Because they need Jesus, in their mind, to screw up. They need him to say the wrong thing to Pilate. And Pilate, of course, is in a bad mood, I'm thinking. And so he's mad, he wants an answer, and Jesus is just very stoic, just standing there, very chill. And I can't imagine a situation like that, Pilate ever seen that before. Ever seen a situation like that. And it was such a dignified silence. This was the silence of a man who had recognized God's will and what needed to be done. Now, as it was said, there was a custom during that time period of Passover where Pilate, or the governor, would release one prisoner. The suggestion is that they had kind of taken some of the symbolism from the fact that, of course, Israel was released by Egypt over the Passover, and so this is kind of their symbolic way of kind of appeasing the people. Because, again, we hear about a lot of uprising. Barabbas was one of the guys who was known for being a zealot. We actually have one of the disciples that's known as the zealot as well. Zealots were, these were rabble rousers. These were rebels. These were the ones who would hiding out in the caves and barren areas and coming in and doing these strikes against the Roman Empire. So these were the people that were striving to beat the rebels. And so this was kind of Rome's way, the governor's way of appeasing the people, kind of bringing it down a little bit, to release somebody. And it was kind of a nice way, I think. So Pilate takes Jesus and Barabbas. And I've seen this scene a few times in different movies. I'm sure you have too. And you have Jesus and you have Barabbas. And Barabbas is the very epitome of, like, the jerk. You know, shouting, being offensive, probably looking pretty rough. You know, not the guy that you really want to have dinner with. And then you have Jesus. And, you know, it's Jesus. And so Pilate comes before the people, and he has these two men, and he says, who do you want released? Barabbas or Jesus? You know, really encouraging. I feel like he probably did that because Pilate, well, he knew. He knew what the right answer was. And I love the fact that, again, Pilate didn't want to make a decision. He didn't want to be responsible. He wanted to wash his hands of the decision. He didn't want to make the choice. He wanted to put it on the people. Because remember, I don't think he liked the religious leaders at the time. Now, he knew which answer the religious leaders wanted. He knew which choice they wanted. And whether, I think he knew the right answer, but I also wonder if he was thinking, I kind of want to poke them a little bit. So I want to make sure Jesus gets released, because that's going to make them mad too. And they had a choice. The people had a choice. But also understand that this was a power play by Pilate in a way too. He knew who was the right one. He knew which choice they should make, but they didn't. They chose Barabbas instead of Jesus. Understand, Barabbas was jailed for not only sedition, but murder. They said, we want a murderer over Jesus. And they knew he was a murderer. And I have a feeling Barabbas was probably the kind of guy that was proud of it. He would let you know. In fact, interestingly enough, I looked this up. Barabbas, Bar-Abbas, means son of Abba or son of father. So Pilate said to the people, in essence, do you want the Son of God or the Son of Father released? Father being more of a humanistic aspect. And I thought that was an interesting perspective on it. Think about that. Do we want the one who gives perfect freedom from sin, or the one that encourages sin? That was almost the choice that was before the people. Do we choose sin or salvation? That was the question being asked by the people. It's interesting what you find when you go down those rabbit holes of understanding language. Do we choose sin or do we choose salvation? Do we want the guilty one or the innocent one? And of course we know their response. We want Barabbas. Free him. What about Jesus? Crucify him. And I love the fact that Pilate then asks, what sin has he done? What crime has he committed? And they don't answer. All they say, again, is crucify him. Now, I've seen in different, again, I'm going back to the films, and you see some of the religious leaders maybe sneaking around in the crowd, encouraging them. Hey guys, we want Barabbas. We want Barabbas. Pass it on. Because their goal was not justice. Their goal was not salvation. Their goal was power. The Sanhedrin at the time had made their choice. They chose power over anything else. You see, Pilate was the same way. He wanted to please the crowd. It was all about self-preservation. He wanted to save himself. Because I think in his mind, if he went against what the crowd said, he would be the next one put to death. Because if it got out that there was a riot, there was problems, there was issues in his province, Pilate could have been the next one dead. And I'm sure that was running through his mind. I know for a fact it was running through his mind. It doesn't say that, but I know it was. He wanted to keep order, and he wanted to keep power, and he wanted to keep his life. Again, this is the Sanhedrin. You see, Pilate, he gave up. He gave up. He went along with a popular choice. The one that the crowd was seeking. The choice the crowd wanted. In essence, Pilate was saying, Jesus isn't guilty, but I'm going to convict him anyways because that's what you all want. He made the choice. Interestingly enough, the fact that Pilate was in power was done by God. I mean, we have to acknowledge that people in power are, in essence, put there for whatever reason by God. It says that in Scripture. So I'm not just making that up. Now, it doesn't always mean that they're put there in power for a good reason. Because we can look through Scripture and we can see instances where somebody was put in power over God's people and they treated them very poorly. But you see, Pilate was given power by God. And he misused that power. He mistreated that power. Yet at the same time, God used his misuse of power to do what God needed to be done. Right? Because remember, Jesus had to die. And the only court that was allowed to put him to death was Pilate's. So it had to be done. But that doesn't mean that Pilate did the right thing. Rather, he did the right thing, but not for the right reason. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. You see, Pilate was trying to pass the buck. He didn't want to make the decision. He was a coward, basically. We have to follow God's leadings. We have to listen to this still small voice. We have to do what needs to be done, even if it's unpopular. So what are you guys going to do with Jesus during this Lent season? How are you going to respond? What choices are you going to make? Are you going to choose the popular choice? Because the popular choice, let's be honest, is what the world says. That's the popular choice. Paul says in Galatians 1:10, am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. Let's be honest. The choice made, the innocent one, Jesus, died. The guilty one was set free. That was Barabbas. But Jesus died for Barabbas too. We are each a Barabbas. A sinner. Somebody who did wrong things, even if we don't admit it. I looked up another phrase, which was probably, even though it's not documented in the Bible, which is probably the thing Jesus heard at the last from Pilate. Abi in crucium, I consign you to the cross. He convicted him. An innocent man, he knew was innocent, but he convicted him. And not just put to death, but the worst death that the Roman Empire would even allow. And it was done to Jesus. The Word made flesh. Karl Barth, who's a theologian, said, God came into our world in its utter unloveliness and frightfulness. Pardon me. He entered into it all. We are not left alone in this frightful and alien land. Let me say that again. Pardon me. Good grief. God came into our world in its utter unloveliness and frightfulness. He entered into it all. We are not left alone in this frightful and alien land. You see, Jesus chose the cross for us. What choice will you make? Will you choose him? Will you choose worldliness? Or will you choose salvation?